All right. Good morning. Happy New Year. This is the third meeting of Howard County FY24 Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. And in the first two meetings, if you recall, we had some intensive discussion regarding Hokubai design and the master plan update, as well as very detailed discussion of the fiscal impact analysis presented by the staff. So today we're going to change the topic. We have two main topics to cover today. Both are important. I think will be interesting to the committee. The first is going to be presented by Angela, our Chief of Staff, about American Rescue Plan Act, which is the federal COVID grants that come to Howard County. And then the second will be a business panel discussion organized by EDA, and they were also going to share some economic data and also business perspective about the county's current economic climate. Both are very important subjects. So I would turn it over to Angela. Do you want to run it from your screen or from my screen, the slides?
Either way, Holly. Do you want to
Okay.
just pull it up if you have it?
Yeah.
Okay, that'll work.
So if I can be allowed to share content, I can
Yeah, because I can't share, so that helps. While Holly does that, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce myself. As Holly said, I'm the Chief of Staff. Some of you who have been here in previous years may have already gotten an overview of the CARES Act funding from Sam Sid, our Chief of Staff, and also may have seen or heard a preliminary overview of ARP, but we did want to give you sort of a cohesive picture. Also on the call is Carl DiLorenzo. He's our Director of Policy and Programs. So among us in the third floor suite, we really identify key planning priorities. We also have Tom Leatherby, as part of Haggerty Consulting. And this is really key because you'll hear later that we have been lauded for our efforts around our federal spending. And we couldn't have done that without our partner, who's really helped us determine eligibility for our federal spending, as well as ensure that we're in compliance across the board. And we have to acknowledge Rafiu Aguile as well as Holly Sun and their teams in finance and budget, because this is such a yeoman's effort in really, receiving funds in such large quantities and quickly, really, determining how to strategically in a truncated period of time spend that money in alignment with our priorities and doing all of that, if you recall, in the midst of actually managing the pandemic. And then we have Felix Fashine and Brian Schepter, who may be tuning in, who are also part of the team assisting. So, as the slides are coming up, I think we have some technical issues. I'll continue on just giving you a background because I think that will help give you a landscape of the federal spending to date. I mentioned the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. In the midst of the pandemic, the federal government recognized how the state and the locals were in dire need to ramp up to directly manage the pandemic. So that was signed into law on March 27th, 2020. And this covered eligible expenses through December 31st, 2021. And, later, 1 year later, after that, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law. And, majority, we really needed to prioritize, again, the first tranche of funding with CARES, the majority went directly to help businesses, schools, infrastructure, and direct assistance to organizations, and especially focused on what was going on with the pandemic and the impact regarding testing, ramping up that. It seems like a distant memory of 2020 now. But if we remember what it was like to buy those supplies, needing, a 90-day supply of PPE, ensuring our fire rescue, police, rec and parks, and our health department were equipped. I think that puts it in context. We also know that the pandemic revealed a lot of underlying issues that were already there, but just exacerbated through the pandemic, and those were our social determinants of health. So, there are pieces surrounding, our basic needs, around food, as well as, transportation and school needs. That was a direct partnership, with our nonprofits. So a lot of the funding, once it pulls up, I'll be able to show you, but a lot of the funding and the majority of that funding went directly to our partners and to organizations, to ramp up all of the needs. So I
So,
wanted to just pause for a moment just to
yeah,
check.
Angela, it looks like the IT folks are still trying to deal with some technology issue this morning that
Okay.
just popped this morning. So I did already send, I just let everybody
Oh,
know
good.
that Paul, we already sent all the materials to the host there via the shared folder. So if people can open your folder currently while we're waiting for getting the technical issue solved, so either you and I can share the screen there, maybe they can open the folder, look at that file at the same
That's a great
time that
idea.
you can start kind of go over the slides there if you have it with you.
Sounds
Thank you.
good, Holly. I'll give everyone just a minute to be able to do that, and then I'll continue on. And I too am pulling it up. Okay, perfect. So if you go to slide 2, which is the review of the COVID relief grants, I gave you a basic overview, but I just want to have the context that there was a lot of federal funding and various funding availability that we have gone after. The CARES Act funding totaled 56.8 million that was allocated to Howard County. It was separated into two entities, and that was 43.1 million to our government directly, and then 13.7 million to the health department. I will say that while our respective departments and government received the funding separately, we did work hand in hand to ensure that hospital, EMS, our fire services, and all the things that I mentioned regarding the ramp up of testing and then eventually vaccine availability, was, prioritized and worked together in partnership. And I will say too that we were recognized for those efforts, both with testing and vaccine. We became a model across the state for the ways in which we prioritized and did mobile vax. We also, as you recall, vaccinated those in their cars who were unable to. So there was a lot of unique and innovative approaches in the way that we maximize the funding. And to date, 100% of the CARES Act funding have been allocated. I also want to recognize, just as a contextual point, because I know a lot of folks are interested in, what the schools and how, we recognize that the schools had a pivotal role in also ensuring that they got the kids virtually moved and ramped that up. The school system has received 38 COVID relief grants totaling 123.2 million. And, Jahan Top Siddiqui is on the phone, so I'm not going to go over actually all the allocation, but these funds are directly managed by the school system. So if you go to the next slide, on slide 3, the overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. I mentioned that this was, signed into law 1 year after the CARES funding, so that was March 2021. And this was, if you look at the larger package across the United States, that was 350 billion to state and local governments through state and local federal fiscal recovery funds. So this was the overall program under SLRF. And then Howard County government received 63.3 million of those federal funds. And this is what I'm going to go into. If you go to slide 4, you know, the ARPA fund use, I wanted to just put this in here so you knew that there are definitely restrictions on how we use the funding. You know, while the CARES Act was really directly to manage the actual pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic on many ways, you know, there were various restrictions that I think the federal government learned from in restricting those funds. And you know, the ARP funding gave us a little bit more runway to plan and also a tad bit more flexibility, but this is why we, you know, work in partnership with our consultant. This is mainly to address, you know, the public health emergency, the negative economic impact. We are able to provide premium pay to essential workers, so that you have seen. We are also able to replace reduced government revenue. So that is a great piece that the federal government recognizes, that there were revenue impacts that we would need to replenish while there is a cap there. And then there was an emphasis as well on infrastructure. So that included water, sewer, and broadband. The time restrictions on the funds is that they need to be obligated by December 31st, 2024. So essentially, we have to have the plan and making sure that the money is getting out ultimately to the entities that are using them. The good thing is that there is a longer time period on which they are spent, and that's by December 31st, 2026. So if you are following along on the slides, on slide 4, or that was the fund uses and restrictions, slide 5, just want to talk about our community engagement to date. Last June of 2021, when we received the first tranche of the ARP funding, because it came in 2 tranches, we received 31.6 million of our total 63.3, and we really committed to an internal process that started over the summer. So if you want to go to that next slide, yep, keep going. That's where we'll pick up on the community engagement dashboard. Yep, thank you. And we decided to solicit proposals across county government for the use of ARP funding. We also engaged the community, and you can see that there were over 200 proposals for ARP funds, totaling nearly 200 million. And putting that in context, we only have 63.3 to spend overall and 31.6 in the first tranche to prioritize. So that right there, whittling that down and determining how to prioritize, I think was it's a very, very big task. You can see that we also then did a survey with the community, and we received nearly 1,200 responses. And there's a word cloud on your right-hand side, and you can see the kinds of feedback that we got from the community. We also made sure that there was a public hearing so that we could hear from those who we may not typically hear from, but also engage all of our leadership across the county. And that had many different participants. And then finally, after we did that, we released a spending dashboard with public reports, which later on I go into. So if you go to the next, the next slide, as I mentioned, there was intake for direct feedback. We also, just process-wise, because this is important context for you to know as we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of the actual spending thus far, we do have a core team of folks between our office, as I mentioned, finance and budget, our consultant, and we meet on a weekly basis. And the need for doing that is so that we can discuss a range of key issues from program development, as well as anything that may be stuck or needing to be creatively done. We look across the enterprise on maximizing our funding from various federal sources and our current funding. We also look at where we need to quickly do grant agreements and also create the spending justification needed for the Department of Treasury. one of the key differences between ARP and CARES is that our oversight and reporting requirements are actually much tighter. So we have to have this process in place to make sure that we are really tight in our requirements in a way that would withstand federal audit scrutiny. Next slide. So here are ARP allocations to date. We are about at 45% 0.5 of the total that have been allocated. To put that 28.8 million also in context is that we continue to build really complex programs and build these partnerships and those grant agreements. So that is really a fluid number, because while that money is out and allocated, there are several million that worth of programs that we continue to focus on. Also, I just want to recap so that we can, sort of put our minds back into what it's been like, to manage these funds. We've had to be responsive in a way that while we had the initial feedback, we recall the various variants, such as Omicron, that really pushed us to adjust quicker investments. Again, when we had those spikes with the variants, we also have, and many of you can understand this as business entities, but a lot of workforce issues across different industry sectors. And while that's not completely unexpected, the intensity of some of our workforce challenges have, again, forced us to adapt. Specifically, we faced this challenge with the school bus drivers, as you recall, and we were able to allocate funding in partnership with a commitment from our schools to provide substantial hiring and retention bonuses. But also, there are positive things that are happening that's causing us to readjust and kind of think strategically, such as the federal infrastructure package. And that was passed, and it allowed us to slide some of the commitments that we had around broadband, water, and sewer to the federal infrastructure dollars. If you go to the next one, you can also see here on this slide, as you saw, our major priorities were around education, business, and whatnot, which I did go over. So now I want to go into what that 28.8 million has entailed. If you go back to education, where we were, that right now we spent nearly 11 million to date. 8 million was to support our educator bonuses in January. So that is key because it resulted in 1,800 bonuses for nearly 8,400 employees. This is the largest bonus of this type in the state. And these bonuses were also directly cited by President Biden when he, presented a speech to the National Association of Counties. So we do wear that banner that with pride. We also focus on 2 million that went directly to hiring and retention bonuses for school bus drivers. And then of that 11 million, also 980,000 was used to support the school-based mental health program. Just want to say that what isn't listed here, because we are finalizing this allocation, is that we commit 3.5 million in scholarships to the Complete for Success program with our community college. And this prioritizes workforce training as well as upskilling and ensuring that those students who are close to completion and who just need those extra credits can do so. This was a strategic use of blending and braiding of our county allocation, as well as the Office of Workforce Development received funding directly from the Department of Labor. So we were able to blend and braid funds in a way that was very creative. And then we are also finalizing our childcare strategy. So we're looking at, the whole continuum of education, and we want to eliminate the before and after care wait lists that we have with our rec and parks programs for childcare, as well as continue to invest, as we did in CARES, to other childcare serving entities. So we go to our next slide. Our next priority.
Angela, so
Yep.
just to add on something there, because
Yeah.
we started without a slide, so folks may overlook one piece on that is, as Angela mentioned, that's $11 million was already allocated from the pot of money county received from COVID,
Right.
and there are continuous efforts on in that regard, and because education is our priority, but that's not the only COVID grant that our
Right.
school system received there, and she has an early slide here. I think here's talk about the school
There
system,
it is.
and
Yep.
some other entities also get direct COVID grants there. I think as of now it's $123 million separately. So it's just like just to put it in context there. So this the piece we give is on top of those there from the separate federal grants there.
Thank you for that. And that's just so important because, I'm cited, for example, the Department of Labor, providing grants to workforce development. There are entities across our enterprise, like education and our school system, that are receiving separate COVID relief funding. So if we go to the next slide, of course, we have looked at our health and frontline workers, providing over $8 million in funding, and these investments cover support for first responders, and county employees had to work in person. We have allocated funding for the Howard County General Hospital, expanding mobile crisis team support for mental health issues, and running the gamut since we continue to see the impacts directly across all of our health entities. And the next slide, Carl DiLorenzo's on the line. If you wanted to chime in here, but housing has been a priority where we've provided $3 million in housing support to date. 2 million of that went to the foreclosure assistance program, 1 million to rental assistance program, and 500,000 to seed into and continue to make sure that the Live Where You Work program is successful. Carl, did you want to add anything else?
Sure. Thank you, Angela. The one point I'll add here for context is this amount, 3.7 million, represents just slightly more than 10% of the total funding that we've provided for housing relief programs throughout the course of the pandemic. Um, we've uh, we've received approximately 35 million in total, uh, both directly through American Rescue Plan and CARES funding, but also large allotments from U.S. Treasury's Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and the state of Maryland's share of the American Rescue Plan funding. So we continue to use multiple federal sources of funding to support housing relief, not just our allocation of American Rescue Plan funding. And we continue to receive allotments from the state and from U.S. Treasury. We recently, for example, received another round of funding from U.S. Treasury and the state in the summer and fall of 2022. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the amount of housing money that we've received and we continue to manage and administer, and pass through to our community providers.
Thanks for that, Carl. So we'll move on to public safety. And this is our spending to date. We continue to monitor and determine what might be additional priorities around public safety. But to date, it's been a little bit less than $500,000 allocated to ranging from our relocation of our repeat offender division. So, and then 138,000 to update our security alarm monitoring. And then finally, 62,000 was for equipment for our body worn camera program. So these were priorities for critical infrastructure around public safety. Next. As you heard, a lot, of funding from our CARES Act went directly to businesses and nonprofits through grants. So this 3.9 million is on top of that CARES funding that was already given. And this was in recognition of some of our entities who were negatively impacted by the pandemic. And it was looking at tourism, small business, chamber organizations, small business outreach, and nonprofit support. Next. Finally, as we've emphasized and continue to, is technology and infrastructure has been very paramount of a need. And we're so grateful that we have this federal funding to boost this infrastructure. Many of you may have heard of the saying scamdemic. So in order to prevent that, we have invested in cybersecurity upgrades, looked at our broadband opportunities in our communities of need, particularly around Elkridge. And then again, for additional upgrades in cybersecurity, specifically for our county wastewater treatment. And on that note, the ARP investment was part of a broader effort on broadband, where we are also, as Carl had alluded to, in receiving federal grants. We're also looking at competitive state and federal grants as well, partnering with BGE, Verizon, Community Action Council, and other organizations. So next. Lastly, these last slides are really just to give you a way to get continued insights on our spending as we continue to finalize our spending for our second tranche, now that that's allocated, since it came in 2 waves. We have this reporting dashboard, and you can see on that dashboard where the funds are being allocated. We also want to just emphasize, as I did earlier, that we do continue to use our funds to the Department of Treasury. And this quick screen capture just shows you what it looks like when you go onto the dashboard. So you can see sort of the proportion of funding that is yet to be used. And if you scroll down, there are descriptions through the website on that. If you go now to, right here, just want to also say that we have been deliberately thoughtful about our planning and community community engagement. And in many ways, we started this early on in the pandemic when we established the HOCO Rise Collaborative, bringing together multiple stakeholders in the midst of the pandemic and flagging what the needs were then. So we continue to use that as a benchmark of our progress, as well as continued engagement on how we evolve and looking at the factors that are affecting us, as well as the other opportunities so we can maximize funding. Our innovative approaches, are that we have been leveraging this use of ARP funding to solicit investments from external entities. So we've actually added over 12 million in support to programs. So our 8 million allocation for educator bonuses leveraged an additional 8.1 million from our school system. So that was a fantastic partnership. Our 2 million for hiring retention bonuses I cited earlier leveraged 3 million also from the school system and transportation savings to ensure the continuation of our bus services, nearly 1.6 to expand critical school-based mental health services, leverage grassroots partnership of 700,000 from Horizon. So that was to the grassroots, that helped grassroots out. And then our 300,000 investment in chamber organizations to support small business was matched by 250K from BGE. And finally, not here, our work to expand broadband in Elkridge through 100K in ARP funding and 65K in CARES funding was supported by in-kind partnership also with BGE Verizon. So the next steps, as we continue to look, I've cited some of these immediate priorities that are just so complex. So it doesn't count as allocated, but we are working through those millions of dollars in funding around childcare, the scholarships I talked about, continue to look at our shelter program and services for unhoused persons, especially during this winter months. That need is definitely more pronounced. We also have funding allocation around reproductive, maternal, and infant health. That is something that the state is looking to fund for Medicaid expansion for maternal health, and we are looking to build that. 10 years ago, we were able to provide funding for maternal health regardless of immigration status. We now are reviving that 10 years later, so that's a major investment. And then, as we know, our capital infrastructure investments are going to continue to be a need. And so that is where we are maximizing all of our federal funding we can for the county dollar. Next. All right, so this is where, I open it up for questions. I just want to say that I'm very pleased to date with where we are, but of course, there's just a lot more work that's to be done. So I'll just open up for any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Angela. So we can take a few questions before we move on to the next subject there. So anybody, if you want to ask questions there, just unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Hey, Angela, good morning. It's Leonardo.
Hi, Leonardo.
Hey, excuse me. Just a quick question here in terms of, obviously we, understand that the ARP funds and the other funds were, significantly needed and gave a major boost to the county as well as to organizations, like the Chamber and Tourism and so forth. In terms of the county, though, just curious as if you could talk, I guess, a little bit about maybe, I guess, safeguards or thought processes just to ensure that there was continued recognition that these were kind of one-time funds and thus the different organizations, particularly within the county and operationally, didn't kind of function as if they would be some type of infusion, or this would be maybe, the same dollar amount might be ongoing or what have you. So if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that.
I see the big smile on Holly's face. And I think that is mainly because, Holly and our teams across the board have, done our best in trying to emphasize that these are one-time in nature. I think the key piece here is that for ARP funding, while it's one-time in nature, I think we have been able to have a little bit more a strategy around planning because the funds can be used all the way up until 2026. However, I think this has been a hardship because, for example, when we look at the bonuses and looking at the impacts to workforce, we do then have to plan accordingly when we make a structural change and actually change the salaries, in some industries. And I think we're going to continue to see that as a hardship across the board. I think, one thing is that during our current budget process and whenever we do, work with organizations and entities and do the grant agreements, we emphasize this to the best of our ability. For example, we did a round of funding early on with our CARES process. And when we did those funding to businesses, as well as we did a combination of innovation and modernization grants and recognition that there was a need for a one-time modernization, we did interview those organizations and say, okay, what are you doing to fundraise? If you're a nonprofit, where can you match? How can you build in strategic planning to ensure that if you modernize, that you can pay ongoing license fees, for example? So I think, this is a point where we welcome, the Chamber partnership as well as EDA partnership and all of our leaders across the board to help organizations understand and prepare and plan for the long term. Holly, did you want to add anything to that?
Not much. Thank you. I think this is a good question. And Angela, you answered really well. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, Angela, I think you did a great job covering all potential
Sure.
questions.
If you have
Would it be
questions in the
okay?
future, don't hesitate to email
I
me
think
or ask.
someone want to say something. Hold on.
Oh, Holly, that was me. Angela, I was wondering if
Oh,
it would just be
perfect.
okay
Tom, I
if
didn't
I.
see you on, so please chime in. Tom, as I have talked about, we really have a debt of gratitude to Haggerty, but Tom can really testify to sort of what we've done with our federal spending to date. Tom?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a brief moment to maybe provide a little bit of context. Given that I have the opportunity to work with jurisdictions of similar size and scope, and some bigger and some smaller across the entire country on a regular basis, I say this a lot to the Howard internal staff, but I thought it might be useful context for this larger group for me to really highlight that the way the county has gone through this process from the beginning of the community engagement, and that ties all the way back to the HOCO Rise report to the all the county's previous community engagement efforts, tying those to the very strategic process that went through with the allocations, bringing in the stakeholders, ensuring that all of the community needs were met, has been really a model for the entire country. It's not a coincidence that the president recognized the county for its efforts. I think Angela was being a little too modest. She failed to point out that the National Association of Counties has recognized Howard County's efforts for financial management of these fundings with its annual award of excellence. And that goes specifically to all of the work that refuse department, Holly's department, the entire team does. I can tell you that my team meets weekly and talks daily with Angie Price and the grant management team in finance, and there is no finer unit that administers these funding anywhere in the entire country, including in the very largest cities. So it's that sort of a compliance infrastructure that's allowing the county to succeed here. And because of that baseline for success, both from the community engagement side and then from the compliance infrastructure side, the program design that's going on is so innovative and is getting to the needs that the individuals and the businesses and the nonprofits in the county really have. Um, there are some really exciting things going on with this funding, and this funding is being leveraged the way it actually should be. Uh, the former chief of staff, Sam Sid, and I did a presentation for a national webinar that Bloomberg Philanthropies put on about Howard County's program design process. And Bloomberg held it out as a model for the entire country. So I just thought that I would take the opportunity to share that perspective, just to tell this group exactly how the county's very hard work and commitment to using this funding is paying off.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Tom. So don't take our word from it. Take it from all the external validators that are also recognizing it. But thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's hard efforts on this.
All right, thank you very much for the team's presentation and also for great questions from the audience there. So we will move on to the next subject, which is the business panel discussion. Can our IT host allow Zark, I think, to share from his screen, and Larry and his team, and also I think there's some business representatives are here also today. Thank you. Thank you, Angela, and Tom and others.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Holly. Yeah, first we're going to run through some of the economic data that will then set up the discussion with our business panel.
Yeah, so Larry, would you like to run the screen from your screen, or Zark is going to do that?
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Zach. He's going to run through a lot of the data. I'll kind of jump in with some color commentary, pick up at the end, and then introduce the panel as it flows. So I'm
Okay.
going to introduce Zach Jones. He's our director of research, who's got a lot of good data to present. We're seeing some good trends, and we're also seeing some trends that are things that we're keeping our eye on, and we're giving you the kind of the unvarnished uh, truth of it all. So Zach, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hopefully you can share your screen at this point. There we go.
Yep, I think
Excellent.
we're ready to go.
Good. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Larry, and obviously thanks to the committee to have us. So, like Larry said, we're just going to really do a temperature check, an honest temperature check on how the county's doing. We're out of the pandemic, obviously. We're in theory back to business as usual. So how has Howard County returned there? But we're going to start off with a national comparison, which is really just going to be like our bragging points. It's why Howard County is the best county in the world. And we can prove that with data. So we're going to start off on a positive note there, but then we're going to get into looking to see how our residents are doing. So we're going to look at housing and home ownership a little bit, and then we're going to dive into our resident employment. So that's going to include your unemployment rate and your labor force, and just really the temperature check on how they're faring in the current job market. Then kind of a little bit of a intricacy here, we're going to shift over to in-county employment. So that's going to measure the actual employees that are working in the county. They could live somewhere else, but they're working in the county. And that's really going to tell us how our in-county businesses are doing. So the first ones we're looking at are residents, and then we're looking at our businesses in the most simple terms. So we're going to look at that and kind of look at the industry trends within the county as well. Then I'll turn it over to Larry, and he'll speak to the commercial real estate side and how we're looking there in industrial and retail, and then he'll speak to the commercial base and headwinds. So kicking it off really quick here with the national standing, just a note, we didn't receive 2020 one-year estimate data from the census. Simply that means there's a gap in our census data. You can see it as a little shaded area. So where you see that, we just kind of average between the two, if anybody goes back to check our data here. So population-wise, Howard County, as far as a 10-year outlook, looking really great compared to the state and the nation. Again, you see Howard County will be blue for the most part throughout these slides. You'll see Maryland as yellow and the United States as gray. So yeah, well above in population growth, and obviously growth is important to keeping us, keeping our balance even. So moving through to again median household income. Howard County has moved up. This chart on the left shows the top 15 counties as far as median income goes. Howard County has actually moved up from 6th to 4th. Which great news. And then you can see on the right here, we have a list, or we have a time series of the last 5 years and how median income growth has compared to both the state and the nation. And again, you can see, we're moving in a positive direction. So then moving a deeper look into median household income here. This slide is kind of the same data, at least on the right chart here, as you saw before, but it's inflation adjusted. So I just want to take a note that, compared to the state, compared to the nation, Howard County, even with the rapid inflation that we're seeing, is still seeing, at least until 2021, we've seen still a positive increase in that real inflation adjusted income. So really positive sign there for our residents. And on the left graph here, you'll actually see those same top 15 U.S. counties. So, we'll consider those the top performers as far as median income goes. We can see our growth compared to them from 2019, which is when we had our last data, until now. So you can see Howard County, we're not leading the pack, but we're third out of the top 15 out of the 3,000. So again, really, really great bragging points there for the county. And again, it shows how successful our residents are and how talented our residents are. Another great bragging point that we love to talk about are educational attainment levels. So we rank in associate's degree and higher. We're now 3rd out of all the counties in the nation, and that moved up from 5th. In advanced degrees and higher, we're now 3rd in the nation, and that moved up from 4th. And in bachelor's degree and higher, we've held at 4th. So great news. We're, again, a very talented resident base. So how are our residents doing as far as housing and home ownership? So here we're taking a look at the actual change of the median home price. We know that housing is a little more expensive in Howard County compared to the state and the national average. So this chart shouldn't be surprising. However, on a more positive note, looking at the actual percent change in these last couple of years when housing has gone up a lot, we can see that Howard County actually on the percent growth side has been a little more conservative. And then this shows our home ownership rate compared to rental rate. You can see that from 2018 to 2021, we've seen a relatively stable growth in that rate, which is positive for us well, one reason that we can show here is the amount of disposable income. The percentage of income that's spent on housing is higher for renters than it is for homeowners. So I'm going to go back and go through these slides a little more closely. So here's the rental income distribution. So these percentages are what percentage of your income goes to paying your housing. So here we have, obviously we can see that 35% or more of your income is our highest portion here. The same for the state and for the US. But what is the positive note about this is that we see that we have less of a portion of our residents in that highest percentile than the state and the US, and we see more of our residents in that lower percentile compared to the state and the US. Similarly, when we look at home ownership costs for the homeowners with a mortgage, we can see that, again, we're spending less money on housing. We have more money to spend on other things, more disposable income. It makes for a more attractive market for retailers. Again, all positive signs for the county. And again, so the more we see that blue bar shifting towards the left, the better it is. That's what we like to see. All right, so then diving into resident employment trends directly. So how are the residents doing? Here's our cumulative employment change since the beginning of the pandemic. So obviously we see the large fall in the beginning, and then we're slowly recovering, ahead of the state, but behind the nation. In the previous iteration of this presentation, we've discussed why are we behind the nation? Well, the state and the county closed a little more intensely. We were a little slower to come back online, and that can have an effect. But as well, there's a myriad of effects, and we'll talk about some of them as we go. But it really is it's a combination of things that have separated how the county has recovered, how the state has recovered, and how the nation has recovered. Obviously, one of those major factors here is labor force. Again, as everyone is, I'm sure, well aware, our employment base cannot recover until our labor force recovers. So this top line here is tracking the number of people in the county that want to work. The bottom line is tracking the number of people in the county that are working. So that bottom line of resident employment can never go through that top line of the number of people that want to work. It's the upward bound. You could never see that blue line cross the yellow line. So until that yellow line comes up to even pre-pandemic employment levels, we can't see a full resident employment recovery. And that's a lot of factors as to what's holding down labor force, and a lot of speculation still. But a lot of them, revolve around, early retirement and, the willingness of people to go back to work for health reasons and for family reasons, work-life balance reasons. All that being said, though, we know that labor force is still not recovered. So looking at the slide, I actually do have a little bit of an update. On the 29th of December, they did release the November data. We're now down to 2.7% unemployment. And if you're looking at this graph, it's actually mostly driven by that labor force going down again. So as we're coming into the holidays, we're seeing the labor force retract. Resident employment went down a tick, but labor force retracted significantly, driving that unemployment even lower, driving that gap between employment and labor force lower. Moving on to a more long-term outlook here. Pandemic included, how are we doing over the last decade? We're doing well. Residents are doing well. We're still well ahead of the state and the US in our cumulative employment change over the last 10 years. That's positive news. We're still heading in the right direction. And then for those curious, here's how we compare against the counties. I apologize, it might be a little hard to distinguish between the 7 different neighboring counties that we've added here, but the general point to take away here is that we're beating all of our neighbors, so that's good. Again, unemployment rates, as you would expect, unemployment is low everywhere. Labor force is short everywhere. So this is what we'd expect to see. And again, compared to the counties, Howard County down there low. Usually we're looking for that low unemployment rate as a positive sign. More recently, we'd like to see it actually go a little higher. We'd like to see that labor force come online, allow our businesses to hire easier. So next, we're going to get into the in-county employment. So that's how our businesses are doing. If you excuse me for 1 second, I am coming over a cold, so I need a sip of water. Oh. All right. So here we have the same kind of job growth from the end of the pandemic that we saw for the resident employment. Now we're looking at those jobs in the county. How are we doing? So different here, we see that Howard County is actually lagging significantly behind both the state and the nation. So this kind of sets up some of these slides that we're going to see. So now here's the 10-year outlook. If you haven't gathered it, we are looking at not nearly as successful of a recovery for the county or for the in-county, rather, employment compared to the resident employment. So here we have the 10-year look at the in-county job growth. But then, interestingly, because we've seen this 10-year look before, but back in 2011 to 2021, and it looked much more positive. So we took a look back further, and if we actually look at the 15-year growth rate, we actually had a much stronger recovery than the state and the nation from the recession, from the Great Recession. So that ended up driving up our numbers in the last time we've presented this data. So you can see on a 15-year outlook, Howard County is looking a little more on par with the nation and the state. Just another way to look at this, again, we're going to compare ourselves to the counties. Right here, we're looking at the pre-pandemic employment change of that last 10 years, right? So how are we doing up until March, or rather February of 2020? We're doing pretty well, 7.6% growth over that 8-year period. We're up there with Anne Arundel, Frederick, Prince George's. Then the pandemic hit. We have not recovered like in Anne Arundel County or Frederick County, not as strongly. We're now kind of with the rest of our neighboring counties in this. We've kind of recovered, but we've barely made it back to. And this is our 10-year growth. This is not just recovery from the pandemic. We've barely made it back to where we were 10 years ago. So again, honest temperature check here. Our in-county businesses are struggling a little bit, as we can see. And then finally, the county business trends. This is going to look at the industry. This is going to look industry-wise. How are our businesses doing? So from top to bottom here, we're listing our largest employers, which is the yellow bar. That's the total amount of employees. And then the percent change that they've seen post-pandemic. So what industries have been most affected in Howard County? So obviously the ones that stick out, leisure and hospitality, that's going to be your restaurants, your hotels. Let's see, trade, transportation, utilities. That's going to include retail trade as well as wholesale trade, as well as logistics and things like that. Everything else should kind of speak for itself. Financial activities, that's insurance, that's your typical financial activity. And then, manufacturing, obviously we see is significantly down, which can be, significantly contributed to by the supply chain issues. Moving forward, to give another perspective on that. So we saw the percentage change and what that looked like. This is looking at the actual employment change. So you kind of get a better grasp of the scope of how much each industry has gained or lost. So you can see, where we saw a major loss in manufacturing, percentage-wise, it's not as significant on the actual real employment level. But again, that industry was disproportionately affected. Excuse me. And then this is now a comparison between Howard County and the state. So again, talking about where we have been disproportionately affected industry-wise, this really highlights it. Leisure and hospitality, manufacturing, financial activities, and still that retail aspect of the trade, transportation, and utilities. Finally, on a more positive note, this slide is showing, it is actually, my apologies, it's backwards. We should have employment change here in blue and firm change in, employment change in yellow and firm change in blue. But swapping those, blue is showing firm change, yellow showing employment change. Our firms in those industries that are heavily affected, we're not losing them at the same rate as we're losing employment. So this is total firm change. We could have some churn between businesses closing and opening, but generally those businesses are sustaining, maybe at less employment levels. That's really what we're trying to show here is employment may be down, but the number of firms has stayed the same. And then finally, this is the year-over-year change of business starts. So it's not cumulative or anything else. It's if we're looking at 2021, how is 2021 doing compared to 2020? So we can see that 2019 we had a low year compared to 2018, but we really recovered in firm starts in 2020. Post-pandemic, there was opportunities. People saw those opportunities. They took those opportunities. Firm starts are up in 2020, 2021. Positive signs. All right, finally, or rather, this is the job losses, just to give some examples, the job losses by industry. So we talked about those super sectors of leisure and hospitality, trade and transportation, but what does that look like more granularly? What are the businesses that make those up? So here are our largest losses by sub-industry, 4-digit NAICS code, 4-digit industry code. So you can kind of, I'm not going to read through all of them, but just take a look, kind of see what's been affected most significantly. And then moving on to the next slide, this is now the occupations that have been most affected. So we've looked at the industries. Now these are the actual jobs within those industries that have been most affected over that post-pandemic period. All right, so finally, I'm going to hand it off to Larry here to talk about commercial real estate and the commercial base.
Thanks, Zach. And if you keep driving for me, I'll cue you on the slide advance. So let's take a look at what we're seeing here in the commercial real estate market, and then this will set up our panel. First, we'd like to take a look at the office space vacancy rate. There is a lot of talk about the future of the office market, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Here you see how Howard County has traditionally been pretty strong in the office market. A sub 10% vacancy rate is, a good sign, a good healthy inventory to be able to move people into. Typically, construction will start in a sub 10% market, and you see it has ticked up a bit over the past couple of years. We're at about 12%. Doing but we are seeing prices still hold steady for now. We're watching the office market closely. We think this will start to shake out over the next several years, but time will tell. Next slide. Here's our retail space comparison, and at the vacancy rate of below 4%, that's still healthy. A lot of debate about the future of retail and how everybody is going online shopping. We're not seeing that right now in the numbers, but prices have ticked down a bit. That is helping some of our small merchants, entrepreneurs get into the retail space, but still a healthy retail market in Howard County. And it goes back to what Zach had said about the disposable income as well. So next slide. Industrial space. We're going to be talking about this in a few moments. It is historically low. 2% vacancy rate is virtually unheard of and is a concern. It's great to have low vacancy, but not this low. We are not able to fill the demand in our industrial market. And also you see because of the lack of supply and the high demand, prices are increasing, which presents another hurdle for some of our manufacturing and distribution businesses trying to get into affordable space. So we're watching. This will be a particular challenge for us in the coming years. Next slide. And commercial base. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about commercial base. This advisory committee mentions growth of the commercial base as a way to enhance revenue every year, and there are some new members on the committee this year. So I wanted to just kind of go through a scenario to describe what does that mean in terms of the commercial base. Next slide. So over the past several years, we have seen the portion of the total assessable base, and it is the job of EDA to work to increase these blue bars here, and this is data right out of the Howard County annual. We used to call it the CAFR. And holding steady even through the tough times. We are still adding to the commercial base. That's good news. This is the property commercial real estate property portion of the total assessable base. So we're holding steady. Next slide. But this is what it means to add to that number. This is an analysis of to go from 18 to 19%, or to go from 18 to oftentimes people will say 25% is a great number to be at in terms of your assessable base ratio. This is an example of what that means. And these are, again, updated numbers from the 2022 annual financial report. This is how we got to the 18%. We have over $9 billion of commercial assessable base of the $53 billion total base. And that brings us to our 18%. And by way of example, we show the MedStar building. Everyone's familiar with it. It's big. It's 200,000 square feet. It's very prominent. And what does that mean? That building is assessed at $36 million, and essentially if you were going to get, if you were shooting for 25% of your commercial base, it would take 104 MedStar buildings to reach that number. A bit of a ridiculous example, but it makes the point. If we were just trying to grow 1%, to get to 19% of our commercial base as part of that that accessible base, we would need, based on the current assessment of the MedStar building, we would need 16 of those MedStar buildings to meet a 19% goal. So we walk through this just to put into context what it means to grow an accessible base. And you know, in our previous years, you know, we would say, you know, we would be able to, you know, absorb about 300,000 square feet of office space a year. You know, now that was a pre-pandemic office market. So, you know, how long would it take to, you know, fill 16, you know, MedStar buildings, you know, almost 12 years. So just a bit of context to demonstrate what does it take to grow an accessible base. Next slide. So headwinds, you know, what are we facing in the future? Obviously, you know, we're in a post-COVID environment. We're not sure what that office market means. You know, and we'll talk to our business panel, get their input. But you know, it is a different office market. Land availability. If we need land to, you know, increase our commercial accessible base, obviously we are challenged by that. And you saw from Jeff Brownow's presentation as part of the master plan, just the lack of you know, large parcel development in Howard County. And then we'll talk about redevelopment as well, because now Howard County is in the redevelopment business. And business climate is always, you know, we have a lot of neighbors that are close by that may or may not have more favorable regulations and climate to do business with. And we're going to talk to Leonardo about some of the things that he's seeing from the chamber and the legislative committee. So those are our headwinds that we're facing. You know, so all in all, you know, things are, you know, trending positive, but we do have some challenges in front of us, as you've seen. So I think that's the end of the slides, right, Zach? And I'm going to introduce our business panel. I've got Karen Cherry, who is Vice President of Leasing for Prologis. And we also have invited Tom Pilon, who is Executive Vice President of Development for St. John's Properties. And we're gonna talk, ask them a few questions about some of the things that they're seeing for your information, to put it into context about business and growing the commercial base. And then we're going to ask Leonardo to jump in with some of the things that the chamber is seeing as well. So I'm going to start with Karen. Karen, thanks for joining us this morning on an early morning after a holiday week.
Yeah, if I'm a little sleepy, I apologize.
No worries. First, Karen, talk just for a moment about Prologis and the portfolio that you do have in Howard County. And, you know, then roll into, you know, what are you seeing in the industrial market, and what does that, you know, what does that mean for Howard County?
Sure. Just to give everybody a little bit of background about Prologis. Prologis is the largest owner of industrial real estate in the world. We have over 1 billion square feet globally. We operate in 37 different countries and pretty much all of the major markets in the US. We really focus on the coastal markets from a distribution and transportation hub. So we're not the owner that's going to have a lot of manufacturing. We're the owner that's going to have a lot of distribution type services, customers in our buildings. Here in Howard County, we have just under 5 million square feet of product. And it's really focused along the Route 1 corridor. We've got a couple of buildings in Troy Hill. We've got the majority of the Meadow Ridge Business Park. We have several buildings in Baltimore Washington Industrial Park, as well as Corridor Industrial Park. So those are really our main hubs within the county. As was mentioned earlier in the presentation, industrial real estate right now is at historically low vacancy rates. Our portfolio in Howard County is 3.5% vacant right now. So that means 6 spaces are available. So just to kind of give you an idea, our typical customer in our portfolio is about 50 to 60,000 square feet. Other markets within Prologis focus on much larger spaces, but here in the Baltimore Washington corridor, our market is smaller customers. Right now, we only have 2 spaces within that size range that are available. All of our other spaces are much smaller, so in the 15 to 20,000 square feet, which is really unusual for us to have those size spaces. All of our spaces that are in the smaller range right now we have 4 spaces in that size range. All of them have at least 2 customers who are kind of competing over those spaces. So it just goes to show you that, yes, rental rates are increasing at historic levels, but it's really a factor of supply and demand. There just isn't the supply, and the demand remains constant, despite the fact that everyone is kind of thinking we're headed into a recession this year, not knowing what that recession is going to look like. Our customers are not seeing a slowdown in their businesses. To give you a little bit of a picture of who our customers are, obviously it's Amazon type customers who are doing e-commerce distribution, last mile distribution. As people are ordering things online, they're the ones that are actually getting you your packages to your door. But we also have quite a bit of home services, so construction, granite companies, cabinet makers, things like that are in our portfolio. And then we also have quite a bit of food distributors, whether that's food to grocery stores or whether that's food services that supply like the stadiums and your Royal Farms, those types of that have the packaged goods. Those are also represented within our portfolio. And again, just I want to touch on the fact that typically the industrial market here in this region is pretty steady. It doesn't increase significantly and it doesn't decrease significantly. So historically, it's been a very steady market with rents that increase, roughly 2 to 3% per year since 2019. So prior to the pandemic, we have been seeing our rents increase over 20% year over year. So prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now, in this post-pandemic world, whatever, the new normal is, we're still seeing over 20% year over year rent growth. So as Larry mentioned, that does cause a problem for some of our smaller mom and pop customers. When they're renewing their leases, they're in most cases almost or actually doubling the rent that they're paying. So they could be going from a $6 square foot rent to a $12 square foot rent. So just imagine when all of their costs are going up, transportation costs are going up, shipping costs are going up, and their rent is going up. These businesses are really struggling. And we as an owner are trying to do everything that we can to help our customers. But it's a challenging time in a lot of ways. It's challenging to try and help them understand the rent growth, but it's also challenging for our customers who are growing. We just simply don't have the product to help them. Right now, we have 4 customers that are looking for 100,000 square feet, and we just don't have it. So it does present a lot of challenges in multiple ways for our customer base. And just to give you a perspective, we call our tenants, we call them customers. So you'll hear me referring to them. Just understand that when I say customers, I mean the tenants who occupy our buildings.
Yeah. So Karen, if are your customers, if they can't find what they're looking for in Howard County based on, our workforce and geography and all the blessings that Howard County has, where are they going? Regionally, are there other places regionally? Are we turning away business? Are they going north, south, out of state?
So it's tough because the whole region, Howard County is not unique in this.
Yeah.
The whole region is experiencing these same challenges. In the past, it, the customers had the ability to really pinpoint, I want to be in Howard County, or I want to be somewhere in the Baltimore, Washington corridor. Now they're saying, I just want to be in the state of Maryland. Or they're even saying, I want to be anywhere from, New York to Atlanta. Find me somewhere in that range. And unfortunately, when it's a larger geographic search like that, Maryland loses, because Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania in particular on the East Coast are all having the same struggle of, we just don't have the capacity to service those customers. So I would say Howard County sometimes loses out to other jurisdictions around us, but I would say in general, the state of Maryland tends to lose out to places like Carolinas and Atlanta, where they do have a lot of land and can build more product to meet the demand.
If you could, if we had just acres and acres, and Prolo just wanted to invest in the area, how much would you build if you could wave a wand and say, boy, I'd love to build in Howard County?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because, first of all, we love the Howard County market. We love, this area. It's perfectly positioned. All of the great aspects of the labor force, and it just supports a really healthy market here. So I don't want to say, we have thousands of buildings, because that's not realistic to meet the demand. If we had land today, and we're able to build, a couple of buildings. Now our buildings are typically 250 to 300,000 square feet in this market. So if we could build 3 buildings right now, if we had a parcel of land that could accommodate 300,000 square foot buildings, we would probably be under construction. And we would probably, based on our demand that we see in the future, we would probably build a building or 2 per year if we had the land. But unfortunately, we just don't have the land. So we have to get very creative with, if we want to do development, we have to get creative.
Well, that would make a lot of our prospects quite happy as well. And but that kind of sets up the discussion about redevelopment. But before I jump over to Tom to talk about redevelopment, Karen, you've got some experience in the office market. And what's your hunch? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you, thinking about the future of the office market?
Yeah. So I've been in commercial real estate for I started in 2000, so it's really easy for me to remember. It's 23 years. Most of that time was in the office market. I've only been in the industrial market for about 2 years now. So the office market post-pandemic is going to look different. My opinion is that most companies are going to want to have an office space. So the office market isn't going to go away, but the office space is going to look much different. It's going to look much more collaborative. It's going to, instead of being, a bunch of private offices and some conference rooms, it's going to be a collaborative space where when the teams are in the office, they are working in collaborative areas, and when they are doing their, heads down type of work, instead of going to a private office, they're going to be working from home or working, elsewhere. But I really think companies need to have that connection, that face-to-face connection, to build culture, and also to help with getting the younger employees up to speed. You can't do training over Zoom. You can, but it's not ideal, and you can't portray your company culture over Zoom. That's just not possible. You have to do that in person. So I think that spaces like downtown Columbia that have amenities right around there will be much better off, much better positioned for the office of the future than places like downtown Baltimore, where you have an issue with crime, you have an issue with parking, there's getting to the parking and then paying for the parking, you've got traffic congestion and you've got a lack of amenities because, you know, there just aren't restaurants in downtown Baltimore anymore. So I think when we're thinking about the office of the future and, you know, like the gateway, the plan for Columbia Gateway, you know, you really need to figure out how do we infuse some amenities into that so that when people are in their office, it's an environment that they want to be in.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, let me bring in Karen, don't go anywhere, but let me bring in Tom Pilon, Executive Vice President Development for St. John's Properties. Tom, talk a little bit about St. John's and your portfolio in the state and Howard County. You guys do have a little bit of office product. I'd be interested to get your take on what you're hearing about the future of the office, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about redevelopment.
Good morning, everybody. As Larry said, I'm Tom Pilon with St. John Properties. My title sounds fancier than it is. When people ask me what I do, I tell them I get building permits for a living, and that's really where my efforts are focused. The way that we do development at St. John Properties is we're a little bit more, we have a little bit more of a siloed approach. We interact a lot, department to department, but my group is not a traditional development arm. We don't start with with due diligence and go through all the design, all that and everything else, and then do the actual construction and get a building leased up and stabilized and kind of hand it off to an asset manager. My group is really focused on when we have something under contract, or as we're looking to put something under contract, we get involved with the due diligence efforts, and principally as they're focused on, what does it take to actually get to a permit? And as we do that, once we go hard on a contract, then we really do focus on getting all the approvals in place, including all the design, focusing on efforts with the architects and the engineers and all the other kind of myriad of consultants that are needed nowadays to bring something to a permit. And then we hand it off to our construction group. So there's certain things that I know about, which tends to be process, and other things I'm not as focused on as it relates to kind of the leasing efforts and the rental rates and things like that. But Karen already shared some good insights into those things. So that's a little bit on St. John Properties. A little more about my group at St. John Properties. St. John Properties was founded in 1971 by Ed St. John, still local developers, although we're currently seeing our real growth is happening in other states. In this last calendar year, we opened a new office in Austin, Texas, and one in Raleigh. And this year, we're scheduled to open another one in Tampa, Florida. We actually have what's called a partner and training program where we bring people in and with 4 years of training, we essentially teach them the business, and then we send them to new locations. And we currently have 6 people in that program. So we're going to see a lot of our growth happening in places other than, specifically in Maryland and Howard County over the next number of years. That said, Ed St. John has an insatiable hunger for development where development makes sense. And I know I'm going to get into talking a little bit about redevelopment, but I'll say that the redevelopment opportunities, as far as we're concerned, we haven't necessarily seen them so much yet. But let me tell you just a quick bit about what we actually own in Howard County to give you a sense of kind of the products that we have in the county, where our experience is. Everybody that knows St. John Properties would know us as a flex developer. That's obviously been our bread and butter over the years, but even that number is starting to get, we have a 22 million square feet of leasable space, and somewhere in the range of 7-8 million of that is flex space. So we've really evolved into a kind of more of a mix of uses. In the county, we have a few buildings over at Troy Hill. That's a flex park for us. Guilford Industrial Park off of Snowden River. Those are old front loader buildings. That's the only development that we have properly in Columbia, actually. The only property that we own in Columbia. Lisbon Center out in the western part of the county off of 94 is a retail center. We're actually working on some this spring. We're going to be starting some, not redevelopment, but renovation of that center. And then Maple Lawn which we've been partners with Green and Palm Enterprises for a number of years. We have some flex buildings there, medical office building, and a number of multi-story office buildings, which, because of the mixed use of that development, that actually includes some retail and restaurants in the multi-story office buildings. That said, everything that we have in Howard County has always performed very well. I think a lot of the numbers that you saw and statistics you saw earlier speak to the kind of the success of the county. We've just kind of struggled in finding opportunities in the county, as everybody does these days. So that's a little bit about St. John Properties and kind of our experience in the county. I'll jump ahead very quickly just to give it. I started in the industry 30 years ago. I was actually working in a very small engineering firm that was located at Route 40 and 29, and I was doing kind of residential land development work. Since then, kind of got away from that, and I've been working for St. John for the last going on 26 years. I actually must have been more than 30 years ago, because it was 7 years there and 26 years. So I guess I'm approaching the 35-year mark. But anyway, in those years, I've done some redevelopment work, mostly in the redevelopment of junkyards. I've done 4 different projects in Anne Arundel County where we redeveloped 4 different junkyards. And I'm actually now working on our very first that I can recall in those 20-some years with St. John, where we're actually going to tear down a building and rebuild it. And that's in Glen Burnie in Anne Arundel County. So Larry, I think you had some questions you wanted to ask her.
Yeah, well, because obviously we're, don't have a lot of greenfield to choose from, so that kind of throws us into the redevelopment business. What are some of the challenges to redevelopment, other than, I mean, if you found a parcel, what are some of the challenges to it? What could Howard County do to, encourage that, remove some of the barriers to redevelopment? Are you finding it easier to do in some places than others? Because we're clearly in the redevelopment game now.
Sure. Well, let me ask you, I had this at the end of my kind of little notes here, but let me ask, where is the county actually seeing redevelopment at this point? And how would you define redevelopment?
Well, we're seeing some of it in some of the older spots along Route 1, but it's occasional, right?
Right.
It's what we need is, larger parcel assemblage so that you can actually do things of scale. And we really haven't seen much of that. But I think that's where we need to be. We've got the demand for it. Now we need the tools to encourage it. And there's a lot of underperforming or not performing parcels in the Route 1 corridor. We see what the demand is, and Gateway it's a redevelopment opportunity of sorts. It's not, probably it's not tear downs and rebuilds, but it's a rethinking of.
It's a repositioning of property.
Yeah.
Like we've seen some of that type of things in other jurisdictions, like in Baltimore City, right there off of 95, just north of Caton Avenue. We bought a building several years ago, and it was a gut renovation. We didn't necessarily do the facade. We didn't tear the skin off the building, but we did a full gut renovation on the entire building. Fortunately or unfortunately, the building was at occupancy level. It was only 20% occupied, so we were able to relocate everybody onto a single floor after we renovated that floor, and then we were able to do the entire building. And you've seen other types of, where people might consider that redevelopment. You've seen some of that. I know, like Merritt, I've seen them do some stuff up in Hunt Valley area where they stripped down to the steel of the building and redid things like that. So, but to stay in Howard County, the place that I think of immediately would have been Route 1. And I did a little Google search on a couple of things, and I see that there's an incentive program of sorts along Route 1, but even that is somewhat limited. So some of the challenges, some of the factors. The first thing is, you mentioned assemblages. Assemblages are difficult because everybody's got, you got to put small pieces together to get a big enough piece to do something with, and the values of those properties tend to be such that it becomes cost prohibitive, and you typically that's then forced you to just go find other opportunities where maybe it was more greenfield development. Obviously, as greenfield development has gotten harder and harder, we just heard Karen talk about even just trying to put together a million square feet in the county. And I don't know what the ratios are for her size buildings, but to do that, you're not going to find 100 acres necessarily. That's probably not an agricultural use in Howard County. That's not likely to flip.
Right.
So you're dealing with existing properties, assuming you can actually get them, you can assemble them. Probably properties that have been in use for a number of years. And in the Route 1 corridor, a lot of that has been uses that have been a little harder on the land, meaning that you're going to encounter environmental issues. I mentioned that we've done, and I worked particularly on 4 different, I mentioned junkyards in Anne Arundel County, all of them coincidentally, I guess. And inevitably, we were either dealing with the state in some manner through Maryland Department of the Environment. You're dealing with environmental issues of some manner. So those by themselves can be challenges, but not necessarily insurmountable challenges. Because a lot of times it's a question of, is it dirty enough to get into a program, clean enough that it won't scare you away and your lenders away. You get into things where you do have existing buildings and things like that. Just demolition costs and things like that. Those are added costs when you are buying properties that people see the value in the asset itself, and you're thinking you're going to tear down the building. That can be a challenge. You're typically, when you're getting into redevelopment, you're in areas that were by definition already developed. So you've got infrastructure challenges, and APF laws tend to apply unilaterally. Doesn't matter if you're doing redevelopment or development necessarily. Oftentimes, because you're in areas that are already developed, you can tend to get community engagement in ways that can be, I'll put it a little more bluntly, you get pushback from the communities. So the standards there will be as high as any other place, and the challenges that you might face would probably be equivalent, if not sometimes greater than that. And then you've got the challenges of the existing financing, like for St. John Properties, the thought of tearing down a building and redoing it. We've got properties that are stabilized properties that are in financing in a way that just the numbers are difficult to say, well, you're going to take down the building and re-go at it. We're not quite at that tipping point yet in our portfolio. In a recent conversation I had with Ed St. John, he did mention, he said, some point in the future, that'll happen, even inside of our own portfolio, but we're not there yet. So as high as the land values are in Howard County, and I was away for a few days over the holidays, and I got home and I've got the assessment notice for my property, and I'll be honest, my value of my home went up by a third almost in the last 3 years. That's significant. I was actually wondering, as you were showing your numbers before, where you showed the bump up in the commercial base, how much that has been due to building versus just increase in value of the property itself. And I'm wondering if the commercial base is outpacing the residential base in that regard. It must be to some extent, I'm guessing, but.
Right. I'll dig into that
Sure.
for you, because that's an excellent insight into, is it net new, or is it just reassessment? That's been the challenge in some ways, growing that commercial base. It's not for some years it hasn't been for lack of construction, but it has been because the residential side is, has been outpacing it. But we'll take a look and see if those numbers are starting to flip.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just, as I was thinking, but you said that, and I literally was sitting on my kitchen table. I walked over and I picked it up. I hadn't done the math. I could just see that it had increased significantly, which wasn't a surprise because we've seen that the housing prices go up, but we're here talking about commercial, so I'll stay on that. You mentioned about, new construction. We have been building right through the pandemic. We've had as good of construction years as we've had really probably in the history of our company, and including in Howard County. And principally, it's actually 100% of our new construction has been at Maple Lawn. And we've been building multi-story office building. We did that right through the recession and right through the pandemic, which was kind of interesting to me because in a lot of other places we weren't necessarily able to build things, so that was nice to see. And we've got another right here down the street from it. We've got another multi-story office building going up right now. We just started, the steel erection is basically complete on that building. So as far as some of the incentives, I already mentioned kind of the idea of, some kind of economic incentives of some sort. In some of the other counties, Anne Arundel and Baltimore County, I know we've been able to take advantage of commercial revitalization. That's really more revitalization as opposed to redevelopment, but they don't limit it. As long as you're making it a certain value of investment, you can get abatement of your real estate taxes, and it can be relatively significant, 5 to 10 years of abatement of real estate taxes. The numbers in my mind, they're like kind of $5 to $10 million of investment, but where you've got opportunities to do that. We had one in Reisterstown, and we've got one we're working on in Glen Burnie right now. It's actually a different one than the one that I mentioned earlier, where we're actually doing a tear down. Flexible zoning and development standards, just kind of generally, and it's hard to define exactly what that is, but one of the other jurisdictions in the last few years, they went in and they did an overlay zone. I would say it was not altogether a perfect overlay, but it was at least the thought, the effort. I think when you get into that, biggest challenge is that, say it a different way, put together a group that actually can tell you what it's going to take to make it happen. In other words, developers, property owners, things like that, let them hash it out and tell you this is what it would actually take. And then you can, as a county, make a decision. And I'm a member, I live in the county as well. So as a county, we can make a decision as, do we really want to see that? Do we really want to incentivize it? But this is the level of effort that it would take on the part of the county to actually incentivize it, to see it, to make it happen. I think that's a real thing. A number of years ago, there was a plan that was being put forward. It didn't ultimately get put into place in the form that was originally envisioned, but Maryland Department of Planning was putting together a thing called Plan Maryland, where they were looking at the priority funding areas, and then they were going to kind of focus more intently on very particular areas of the priority funding areas and say, that's the targeted growth areas. And they, ULI, Urban Land Institute, put together a series of work sessions where they invited people to come participate. And I was invited to one of these panels, and we spent the day. They had us read the whole plan, and then they asked us a bunch of questions. And the first question they asked us was, why aren't we seeing development happen where we think it ought to happen? And you could ask the exact same question. Why don't you see redevelopment happen where you think it would happen? But it was a very quick answer. The minds all came together. It was just barriers to, getting over that. All of the standards were the same. In other words, where you wanted to have it happen was the hardest place to make it happen, because the infrastructure was stressed, because there was, community involvement was at such a level and things like that. Not that those are necessarily bad things. They're just challenges that add costs, and cause people to go look for other opportunities. So in other jurisdictions, I think you asked that question, there are some incentives, but I'm not really sure that a lot of the area is really ripe for it yet, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then I asked you my question about kind of where the county's seeing it happen, and you're not necessarily seeing it happen yet. There's still some infill development going on, right? And Karen mentioned earlier downtown Columbia, and that's really infill development, right? I mean, there was some, some level of stuff maybe that came down or was planned to come down, but vast majority of that was it was still infilling itself. It was still building itself out and intensifying, which is good and positive stuff. So anyway, hey,
Excellent.
hopefully that's
No, Tom, great,
Tom.
great insights, and it kind of leads us into. I want to kick it over to Leonardo. As you were talking about some of the zoning and regulations and things of that nature, and Leonardo, you run a couple of committees, legislative committee, land use committee. And your membership. What are some of the things that you're hearing?
Well, thanks, Larry, and good morning to everyone. And in some respects, I mean, it's not a lot of differences, particularly in terms of, I think, of what Tom just mentioned. And I guess for context, in terms of the chamber, I was thinking at first I would just so our membership is largely going to be in that professional services area, particularly that was shared by Zach when he was kind of just breaking down the various industries in terms of who was performing well and so forth. But I think at the same time, we also have some of those industries as well that certainly that we know were impacted as a result of COVID and the like, particularly when you look at the hotel, hospitality industry, restaurants in particular. We probably have limited on the retail side. And so that's kind of just the membership from a general perspective and makeup. But then the other thing, as I thought about just this conversation, there's probably, I guess, maybe two different groups as it relates to, quote, doing business in the county and their experience and so forth. Obviously, you've got those that are in the development realm or they touch it in some form or fashion, whether they're actually developers themselves, whether they're engineering, whether they do architecture, whether, they're involved in the process. So you've got them. And I would say some of the comments and things that we're hearing is that, certainly, and again, I think Tom, touched on this, is the fact that it is becoming a lot tougher to, to develop. And in some cases, if those that are doing infill, maybe where they're purchasing lots here or there, and it's maybe more on the residential side as opposed to commercial, that, again, it is getting tougher, whether that be by policy or by community pushback and the fact that, hey, developers are continuing to adversely impact schools and so forth and so forth. And then obviously you get into the piece of just the cost, whether it be APFO and so forth. So you've got the development side of the house, I guess you could say, from a membership standpoint, and those opinions. But then the other side, as I would say, is just those that are what I might call non-development, but maybe just from a business perspective. And in particular, when you start getting into some of those that retail, maybe some warehouse type restaurants that, quite honestly, at the time that deal with maybe, your everyday laborers and in some respects your lower wage workers. And particularly, it may also even have tighter margins in terms of from a profitability standpoint. And so for them, I know that one of the big things, regardless as to how you feel about it, whether you agreed with it or not, but just from a business standpoint, many of them certainly, had heartburn over the recent minimum wage increase. And particularly, it was because of the fact of there was such widespread give and take and debate at the state level to get us to where we are now. And then when the county decided to move things faster than the state level, it was kind of like, well, wait a minute. We took all of this painstaking time to hammer out something statewide, but yet we do something countywide that moves us faster, in addition to the fact that we've had supply chain issues. We can't get workers in the first place. That for many of them, it was a case of the challenge of there already are just things impacting their business. And so I think as we continue to look forward, I think if anything from an atmosphere standpoint, what will be of interest and what those will be watching is, okay, if we go through some other what might be deemed controversial or what have you, discussion at the state level, will the county ultimately decide to do something that perhaps makes things even more stringent, or that now move, and also from an implementation standpoint, makes it perhaps more difficult if you're doing business in multiple jurisdictions. It's one thing if you are the likes of, let's just say, a Giant, and you've got an infrastructure in place that you can do some things where you recognize that, hey, I've got stores in Anne Arundel, I've got stores in Baltimore County, I've got stores in Prince George's, and you've got an infrastructure in place that you can make it work. Whereas if you're a smaller merchant, that maybe you have only a handful of locations spread out about, a Baltimore County and a Howard County and a Montgomery. And what does that do when, you're now dealing with a different set of rules in each location, again, from a small business infrastructure perspective. I think broadly, and this doesn't necessarily impact maybe this group per se, but maybe indirectly. And I think other things that are going to come about statewide as we look at particular blueprint and continued implementation there, and recognizing what we continue to spend in education here. And ultimately, if there's certain requirements that are put on the counties statewide, well, what does that do for business? And or more so, a business going to be asked to perhaps shoulder a larger percentage of that as we look to implement certain requirements from the state. And again, just the last thing, I think it's one of those where certainly we recognize that, education as an example has been one of those things that lead to a high quality of life. But I think at the same time, they also look at how do you pay for these things as well. And as one group perhaps being disproportionately burdened than the others.
Yeah. Leonardo, you bring up a point, and let me turn it over to Karen and Tom as it relates to your tenants or customers. Are you seeing certain things that compared to maybe other places in the state that are permitting or regulations that you're hearing from your tenants, customers, that make it harder or difficult or more expensive? Or
So I think permitting is always a challenge. It can add time and cost to the process. On the industrial side, there's two different permits. So there's a construction permit that needs to be pulled when there's work that's done to the space, and then there's an occupancy permit that's pulled when the construction is completed and the customer wants to take occupancy. Then there's a third permit that if the customer is going to install racking, that's a separate permit. So we had an issue recently where the customer wrote a letter to the county that basically said, this is the product that we're going to be storing. We're not using racking. Racking will be installed at a later point. Now they were storing solar panels, so it was a little bit of a higher level of product, which typically requires certain things for the sprinkler, life safety issues in the building. Our understanding of the building for floor storage of the solar panels was that our sprinkler system was sufficient. But unfortunately, this letter, because it mentioned that racking would be installed in the future, was flagged and sent to life safety, which life safety then required a flow test of our sprinkler system to make sure that our sprinkler could accommodate the future racking. Now, the county said the customer can't occupy until we do this, which didn't make any sense because occupancy and the racking should be two separate permits. The construction permit was completed. We wanted to call in the final there, needed the customer to get in and operating, and then deal with the racking permit in the future, which would then trigger, the flow test of the sprinkler system. Fortunately, we were able to argue our case with the inspectors, and we were able to allow that customer to occupy. Unfortunately for us, the flow test showed that because the customer was going to rack higher than 12 feet and because it was solar panels, that we would need to upgrade the system from a wet system to an ESFR. And I won't bore you with all the details of what they are, but basically in an older building like that, it's a 20-foot clear building. We would typically not do an ESFR system. It's very expensive. But because of these qualifications with what the customer's storing and the fact that they're going higher than 12 feet, that was required by the county to the tune of $500,000. Now, an owner like Prologis has the ability to absorb that kind of a cost. My concern is for other owners that don't have the financial backing of a global organization like ours, that kind of a impact on their business, putting that kind of a capital expense into their building is then going to be translated into higher rents because they would have to recoup that cost in some way. So I guess I say that example to prove the point that it would be helpful for our customers and for us as owners to have a better understanding of the requirements when it comes to things like sprinklers, things like, the parts of the permitting process, because it seems to be a case-by-case example or a case-by-case scenario too many times. And if we had more of an understanding of standards, or if there were standards rather than one inspector thinks this and one inspector thinks that, I think that's one of the challenges that we've run into a little bit more often with Howard County than with other jurisdictions.
Good example. Good example. And that goes to the business climate, Leonardo, that you're constantly, talking about. So, but
I think the word that's been used oftentimes has been predictability.
Yep.
And I think that for some, at least, that have been in the county for a while, the sentiments has just been that some of that predictability is waning, and that there's not a concern with things being hard, that no one wants standards to be sacrificed, and standards, whether that be from an appearance and design perspective, or standards, whether that be health and safety, that no one wants standards to be sacrificed. It's just they don't want necessarily the rules changed either midstream or otherwise. That look, just let us make sure we know that the the rules that we're playing by, and then we'll adhere to those. But let's make sure that those rules are consistent and enforced equitably and so forth.
Exactly.
excellent. Good. Well,
And it looks like Tom might have been wanting to say something.
Go ahead, Tom.
I thought I had unmuted myself, but I didn't. Excuse me. One thing that we bump into, and we've encountered it in Howard County. I'd say we've encountered it more in other places, but it's a indicator of probably things to come. Are talking about the kind of the predictability, consistency, and things like that. Is change of use. You've got an existing building that's been being used for any number of years, and you get a different tenant in there that wasn't anticipated by an original traffic study, and things like that. And to put in sometimes a relatively small tenant, or even a large one, you end up having to go back and recreate information as if it was a new building. Just by a change of use, it can be as simple as you've got to update your site, your SDP, your site development plan, to as complicated as, there could be questions about, are there traffic issues, and would there be mitigation required, and things like that. Where you've got existing buildings, that is a good example, I think, of something that you want to, if you don't see redevelopment as such, where buildings are getting taken down and put back up in new form, just that idea of the refreshing of tenants and things like that should be the easiest thing in the world to do. And I'll just stop there, but
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that, insight. It is very helpful. And Holly, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you have questions, or if the group has questions for the group. But we kind of present this to the group because spending affordability is, as much as this group looks at the expense side of the equation, on the revenue side of the equation, and to give you hopefully give you a flavor of, commercial base and what it takes, and, the the challenges that we have as we try to, continue to grow our commercial base, because it's an important part of the revenue formula. So Holly, I'll turn it over to you and to the group if there's any questions for EDA or this august panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Larry, and also the whole panel is really very informative and also very helpful for the government. So we only have a couple minutes here, and we probably can entertain one or two questions here, but this is very good. Thank you very much, everyone. If anyone have question, please just unmute yourself. Okay. And if you have follow-up question, you know where to find Larry and myself and Leonardo. But thanks again. This is really great. A lot of data, a lot of perspective sharing, and also including the policy implications there. So we all take it to our heart there. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah. And with that, I think we need to adjourn the meeting and look forward to next week's discussion. Next week's the meeting is going to come back to HOCO by design and look at some sensitivity tests as well as Q&A related to the financial impact analysis for HOCO by design. And again, thanks everyone for all the presenters and also for the people who help up in the back on the IT side. And thanks everybody for coming, and wish you a new year. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve Hunt here. Sorry about that.
Go ahead, Steve.
Very, very quickly, I promise 30 seconds or less for both Larry and Leonardo. I guess more for Larry since it was the EDA's presentation. There's a lot of data that went up to 2022, but I didn't really see anything in the way of projections as far as where, based on how things are trending, do you all see things going as it relates to the commercial base, which obviously would be an important factor as we're looking at what 5-year revenue growth looks like. So if that's something as a follow-up that you guys could work, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. And I think your point, it really speaks to how well we can get into the redevelopment business, and the repositioning of Gateway. I mean, downtown Columbia is well on its way. And it's those two components that I really think sets up Howard County for growth. And we can work on some try and quantify that numerically, but that really is how we see the future of commercial growth in Howard County is that the redevelopment business, and it's a big part of the HOCO by design plan as well.
Great, thanks, Larry. Appreciate it. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Leonardo.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you.